I'm going to be talking about the total state, which is essentially a synonym for the totalitarian state. Totalitarianism is the negation of everything that we've been talking about this week. It is the wholesale abolition of liberty in every direction. It is the total fulfillment of government power. Mises famously said, or maybe not as famously as it should be, government is the negation of liberty. So, total government, you can do the math. In the United States, it's fashionable to call your opponent a totalitarian of some sort. This is often seen as polemical and irresponsibly hyperbolic, often by the very same people who engage in the hyperbole themselves. For years, the left tended to call George W. Bush, many of them called George Bush and his administration fascist and totalitarian, and compared it to other fascist regimes. And now we see the Obama administration, and Obama himself described more often as communists, although we do also sometimes hear his detractors describe him as a fascist. And this fascinates me because one day people will be very offended at the comparison. The next day, some of the same people will use the comparison. And this is all compounded, this irony, by the fact that actually the policies of Bush and Obama, or the mainstream Republican and Democratic parties, don't really differ all that much. Now, there's a sense in which it is indeed hyperbolic. It indeed confuses the issue to refer to the United States or the Bush or Obama administrations as totalitarian, at least if we're comparing them to totalitarianism more traditionally defined. But there's another sense in which the term itself poses a lot of problems. The term was, if not coined, it was popularized by Mussolini, who was in many ways the first successful fascist leader, the epitome of fascism. He used the term favorably in 1921 to describe his agenda, favorably comparing it to the Marxist one. He said that totalitarianism involves, quote, a centralizing and unitary state that imposes on all an iron discipline. This system involves the idea of politics over economics and a sort of new humanity brought about through state power. Now, one definition by a political scientist, C.J. Frederick, that has at least implicitly guided our understanding of what totalitarianism is it's a system, it's a regime, it's an ideology that constitutes several key elements. One, you have a single party at the head of the state. And at the head of that party is a single man, or single person, but usually a man, who is charismatic, who leads through force and power and his own charismatic sway. You have terror, a system where the police, the military, other armed enforcement agencies of the state crack down on dissent and manage their rule through terror, through frightening people, through using force, violence, torture. You have monopolistic control of the media, monopolistic control on weapons, central economic control, a centrally planned economy, and an ideology that guides it all and ties it all together. And generally, this ideology is said by many theorists to involve some sort of historical view of what the state, what your state represents in terms of history, in terms of what our destiny as humanity is, and in terms of what the state can do to bring that humanity along to a more idealistic state. In a sense, it's eschatological. It's kind of religious, messianic. And in the case of fascism, in pretty much all cases, we see that it's also highly nationalistic. The nation state is elevated above party ultimately, above the other conservative institutions, the church, the family, business. These are all important. They're not totally displaced under fascism, but they are subservient to the nation state. Generally, in distinction from fascism, and yet also as a sign of a kind of a leftist version of totalitarianism, we hear of communism. It's very common for people to compare the two, communism and fascism, noting their similarities. But you'll know through history, the fascists always regarded themselves as anti-communist, saw themselves as distinguished from, opposed to communism. And the communists saw themselves as, in many ways, the opposite of fascism. And this raises many questions, which I will get to. Now, communism in the 20th century sense is, of course, rooted in Marxism. And as I alluded to earlier, Marxism, in some of its core tenets, was in a sense a distortion of classical liberalism, in that Marx drew from the classical liberals this conception of the state as the enemy, as the rulers, as those in power who subjugated the masses. And it's true, he did this kind of sleight of hand, where he says that the state is the tool of the capitalist class, and eventually we will take over the state. We will liquidate the capitalist class, establish a proletarian dictatorship, but eventually the goal of Marxism is to eliminate the state. The state withers away. And it's fascinating. At some points, Marxism refers to the state itself as the engine of oppression, as itself is the threat to freedom, he would even say at times. And at other times, he conflates state and the capitalist class. And this conflation is what allowed for what is in some ways a revolutionary anti-establishment, anti-state power ideology to have been transformed into its very opposite. Now, there are many tenets of Marxism that, whatever you might think of them, they're rather idealistic. They speak to something that does appeal to many people, maybe most people on some level. The end of exploitation, the elevation of the workers, the end of their suffering, and indeed the suffering of workers throughout all of human history was very significant. Moreover, Marx was anti-nationalist. He believed in an international brotherhood of man, where class was what determined where you stood in relation to power, where you stood in relation to the hierarchy. It was class, and all of the people throughout the world who were exploited should be seen as on one side, and all the nation states with all of the capitalists, presumably, in charge of them were on the other side. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. Marxism was thought to have its greatest chances in an industrial capitalist country, because Marx saw history as following an inevitable design. There is a frightening inevitability in Marxism, and this inevitability is sometimes characterized as dialectic materialism, where there are different forces, the forces of capital, the forces of the workers, the forces of peasants, and these forces coalesce, and the end result is eventually communism and the withering away of the state. But he saw some steps as inevitable. He in fact saw capitalism as in many ways a progressive step from feudalism, and believed that capitalism was necessary. It was a necessary step between feudalism and communism. And so it was thought that communism would first catch on naturally somewhere like in Germany, where you had industrial, so-called capitalist society, where the contradictions of capitalism would be seen in a way that they couldn't have been seen, the way oppression couldn't have been understood under feudalism. And the different forces in society would culminate in the rise of Marxism and the elimination of the state. That part ends up getting lost on a lot of people. But that's not how communism entered this world. It didn't begin in industrial Germany. It began in Russia, a thoroughly agricultural society. And it was the specific circumstances of World War I that helped bring this about, as well as decades of the legitimate grievances of the peasants, the workers, and in World War I, the soldiers, who saw the state of Russia, the imperialists, as the enemy. So right away, Lenin capitalized, a sense, on the conditions of World War I. And it was World War I, the chaos of World War I, that allowed the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, to take power. And that wasn't the first compromise with Marxism. Lenin also had to explain something. Why weren't all the workers rising up? The prediction under Marxism would have been that all the capitalist countries fighting one another in World War I would have exposed the contradictions of capitalism and led to a solidarity of all workers throughout the world against their respective states. But instead, most workers' groups, most labor groups, most leftist groups eventually folded and joined their own nation states. Eventually, they saw their own nations as on their side. Their bosses, as much as they disliked them, weren't as bad as the Huns or the French, depending on which side you were on. And this was perplexing. So Lenin came about with an adaptation upon Marxism, which was his theory of imperialism. He believed that the state, the imperial capitalist state, had managed to keep the standards of living of the average worker higher than they would have been. And in fact, Marxism would have predicted that workers would get poorer and poorer and poorer under capitalism until they revolted. But they weren't. They were getting richer, richer, richer. Despite the dislocations and difficulties and pain of the Industrial Revolution, the masses got better and better off, however inequitably. And Marxism couldn't explain this. So Lenin believed that it must be imperialism, colonialism. These states created markets in foreign satellites by invading, conquering, creating imperial outposts throughout the world, forcing open markets, impoverishing the third world, and enriching their own, including, to some extent, the working class. Also, Lenin, in coming to power, promising to end World War I, made a deal with Germany, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was the peace treaty that ended the war between Germany and Russia. He gambled that Germany was going to lose anyway, and so some of the concessions he made would become irrelevant, and he was right about that gamble. But this did enrage some fellow communists who saw this as a completely unacceptable compromise, because in the treaty, he gave up Russia's claims to Ukraine, Belarus, Finland, and the Baltic states. And then you had war communism. The Marxist state, it brought about peace, but it waged war with Poland. And of course, it went after people based on class. And this is a theme that comes over and over in communist history, where who are the real enemies? Well, they end up being the peasants who have just a little more than the other peasants. And in the case of Marx, or in the case of Lenin, sorry, these were the kulaks. And as time went on, these groups that were defined as class were also becoming defined in national terms. And although Lenin never fully embraced nationalism like later communist leaders, he was flirting with it a bit. His last major compromise with idealistic Marxism was abandoning it. After the failures of war communism, having been prodded by other advisors, he decided to institute the new economic plan, which was, in many ways, a move back toward the free market. some would say, a move towards certain free market principles that were never embraced in Russia. The privatization of land, giving plots and allowing people to trade, getting rid of this fantasy of totally abolishing money. So by the end of Lenin's term, if we could call it that, it was not Marxism in the international sense. It was not Marxism in the historically inevitable sense. It was not Marxism in the economic sense. Meanwhile, there was another force coming to be in the 20s, in the early 20s, as a response to World War I as well, and the conditions brought about by World War I. And that was fascism. As I said, Mussolini in many ways admired the Bolshevik state. And Mussolini actually himself dabbled in Marxism and syndicalism early on. He saw a lot in common with Marxism, although fascism was paradoxically pitted against Marxism as its mortal enemy. He was influenced by Marxist economics, by the possibility of scientific economic planning, and also by this kind of historical view and this materialism, whereby all events that happened, all events, all physical reality was all that mattered. And what really matters are the physical conditions, specifically the material conditions that arise between the workers and their oppressors. And everything else, ideas, art, political ideology, these are epiphenomena. These are, in a sense, simply manifestations of the physical, of the material. And he agreed with the Marxists on that. Meanwhile, we had this guy, Adolf Hitler, who had served Germany in World War I, who, like many Germans, was very much disgusted by the Treaty of Versailles and the war guilt placed on Germany. And he also represented this kind of fascist system, the system whereby the state would bring about what was historically inevitable anyway, whereby the state became superior to these other institutions, although did not totally displace them in theory in the way they did in Marxism. And for Hitler, there was an added philosophical tenet that is at its core. All fascisms involve nationalism, and often ethnic nationalism. But Hitler took that to a level that was probably never seen before or since. Make no mistake, Hitler's anti-Semitism was completely central to his ideology. And in a little bit, I'll explain a little bit more about that. Mises, of course, and the classical liberals were critical of fascism, especially the worse it got. And they were critical of socialism. And they had an astute analysis, as Ivan Progresic talked about, regarding the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism. And one thing that socialists and fascists agreed on was that liberalism of the old sort was totally out of the question. They all agreed that liberalism was bad. They all agreed that it was antiquated. And the intellectuals in the West who came to admire Mussolini or Lenin or later Stalin, and to some extent later even Hitler, these intellectuals saw fascism and communism as the future. Central planning was the only way. Scientific management was necessary for the world to unfold as it must and as it should to serve the masses. Individual liberty, even the idea of an individual as the primary unit in society, had to go. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Stalinist and Nazi systems by way of discussing the most conspicuous aspect of their regimes that I think colors the way we think about them: mass murder. Timothy Snyder is a professor at Yale. He has a wonderful book Bloodlands that I very strongly recommend you read, and some of what I'll be saying is drawn from his research as well as his conclusions. Snyder is one of those scholars that makes you want to just give up and not even bother reading anything. He reads, I believe, 10 languages, maybe 15. He's done archival research in the original languages of most of the relevant states in Eastern Europe as it concerns the 30s and the 40s. We think of Stalin, we think of Hitler, we think of mass murder, don't we? I think most people do. Who killed more, all that. It's a dominant part of our understanding. But the way we think of both is usually pretty flawed. There's this understanding that Stalin terrorized his own people, and he surely did. He ruled his own people, he controlled them. He put lots of people within Russia in gulags, and he did slaughter a number of them. But what's fascinating is the extent to which his most conspicuous acts of mass murder followed a different pattern, a pattern that is a little bit more, let's say, traditional when it comes to state mass murder. It is likely the case that Stalin's worst crime was the famines of 1931 and 32, and in particular the Holodomor in Ukraine. Stalin saw, this is important in every way in his break from Marxism, Stalin saw certain national groups as anti-Russian, and thus anti-Bolshevik, and thus the capitalist enemy. And he targeted groups, and he targeted the Ukrainians. Now, one of his biggest reasons was also kind of traditional. He wanted their food to feed the Russians, to feed his people. And Ukraine, being especially fertile, unlike much of the other land that he controlled, was his envy. He just wanted that food. In the early 30s, he instituted a number of measures to starve Ukrainians and to bring the food to his own people. And for years, scholars debated the extent to which this starvation was deliberate. Well, it seems pretty clear that it was deliberate, short of him, setting out from the very beginning to say, I'm going to starve as many as I can. But he knew they were starving, and he kept issuing more orders. What kind of orders? He would say, you have to turn over so much grain, and if you can't turn over that much grain in your plot of land, in your village, in your town, we're going to up the amount of grain you have to turn over. And if you can't do that, we're going to go after your livestock, and we're going to confiscate your animals. And any family that had at least some livestock knew that it wouldn't starve just yet. But when they go after your animals, after you're done with your grain, you're dead. And you don't die, in a very quick manner when you're starved to death. There are very painful accounts of what happened in Ukraine, as well as elsewhere, especially a little earlier, where Stalin's also starved people, Kazakhstan, for example, where he starved people, perhaps not quite as deliberately. But the fact that it happened and he repeated his policies in Ukraine further bolsters the thesis that this was deliberate. There are these horrible accounts of orphanages where children are eating one another and themselves, accounts of people selling their family members. And this all sounds totally crazed and uncivilized, the total opposite of anything anyone who has an ounce of humanity should want to happen to anybody. And that's because that's what it is. That's exactly what it is. It's hard to think of a worse way to murder someone than to starve them to death. But that's what Stalin did. And there was definitely a nationalistic element, and there was a strategic element, and there was also an ethnic and element, and also just that core reason of wanting the food. Later in the 30s, he unleashed his national operations, which were also somewhat different from how we think of Stalin's great crimes. They were not just directed willy-nilly against everybody. And yeah, they were directed against political enemies, but that kind of is a distortion too. We think of these show trials of his of communist leaders that have fallen out of favor with Stalin. And that happened, and that was awful, right? The problem with talking about this stuff when you're trying to compare or discuss different kinds of suffering is even the people who suffered the least under these regimes went through something I literally wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But there are degrees, and sometimes you have to try to grapple with them to try to understand what happened. And the height of his terror, though, the bulk of his terror in the late 30s was not just this willy-nilly attack on everyone, nor was it just directed at political enemies, but it was directed largely against ethnic minorities such as the Poles. He saw the Poles as non-Russian and therefore anti-Russian and therefore anti-Bolshevik and therefore suspect. And anything that went wrong, as in Ukraine, was to be blamed on the enemy. It couldn't be his own policies. In the 30s, the Nazi regime also came to power, of course. Hitler had tried to come to power in the 20s with his failed beer hall putsch, which is actually the traditional fascist way of coming to power. You bring a bunch of people, you bully the people in the streets, and you rise up and just seize power, which is closer to what Mussolini did, kind of. But Hitler failed at that. It was a disaster. He ended up going to jail. And it was the political process that brought him to power. And the whole time he saw politics as a sort of compromise, because it wasn't politics he was interested in. It wasn't even the state, taking over the state that he was interested in. It was the Volk. It was the fulfillment of the inevitable rise of the Germans above those who had been oppressing them. It was a combination of old-fashioned racism and some would say almost a left-wing egalitarian envy, although I would be very careful about putting it in those terms because he is in a class of his own. He viewed every nation as naturally being bound up in ethnicity and culture. He saw states as sort of just proxies for what really mattered, which were the tribes. His view of the world was biological. It was primordial. He saw our role in the world as determined almost entirely by our blood, by our race. And he saw the natural course in history as different groups vying for control of territory. This is clear in Mein Kampf as well as in his second book. And he saw that after World War I, or at the very end of it, despite all this talk about free trade, the British starved German civilians to help win the war, and even after the battles ended. He saw that the British, with their fleet, controlled food. Free trade's great, but if you control all the seas with your navy, it's not free trade. You're just reverting back to that old-fashioned, you know, kind of Hobbesian tribalism. And the British, at least the British, who he admired in great degree, he wanted to be like them. He didn't want to really go to war with them. That wasn't his first goal. They were just doing what the British would naturally do. He saw capitalism as this Western enemy embodied in Britain, the United States, but especially in its most nefarious sense in the Jews. Capitalism was run by the Jews. The banks were run by the Jews. And he looked eastward and he saw the Bolshevik regime, and he also said that was a Jewish regime. He saw Jews to his east, he saw Jews to his west. And this is important to acknowledge because within Germany there weren't that many Jews. When World War II actually began, Jews constituted about 0.5% of the German population. And ultimately, 97% of the Jews murdered in World War II never spoke German. So his hatred of the Jews was so central to his ideology, but it's hard to explain in the typical sense of racism where people have animus against those around them. It's a geopolitical hatred. But he saw the Jews as different from every other group. Every other group played by the rules. You fight for your own race, you crush those that need to be crushed, you take what needs to be taken, you expand your territory. That's the way it should be. We play by those rules. He was confident the Germans would do just fine, and maybe some other people would do just fine too. But the Jews didn't follow this rule. They didn't have just one nation state. They were everywhere. They weren't just a nationality. They were an ethnicity, a religion. They were a culture. They were everywhere. They had influence everywhere. And so it wasn't so much an anti-Semitism based on German supremacy. It was based more on, if anything, a sense of inferiority. The Jews were somehow able to rise above the rules of nature, and thus they needed to be dealt with. They needed to be purged. They eventually needed to be pushed eastward, perhaps deported to Africa, and if all else fails, eliminated otherwise. In the 1930s, which was when Hitler was at what we might call peacetime, he only murdered, and I use that word only in a relative sense, he only murdered somewhere around 10,000 people. Stalin had murdered 3.5 million or so in the Ukraine, a million or so others through starvation, a million or so others through terror, through acts of shooting, lots of people shot in the head. Stalin was far more murderous than Hitler until World War II. And this is where Hitler also defies conventional wisdom, because in his case, as with many other cases, war was the health of the state. And it was the fulfillment of his ultimate goals, although he didn't actually get away with nearly what he wanted to. These are the bloodlands as defined by Tim Snyder. Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. That is where the vast majority of mass murder occurred during World War II in Europe. Vast majority. That is where all but a couple million of Stalin's victims were murdered. That is where all but considerably less than 1,000 of Hitler's victims were murdered. It was also where the bloodiest front in the war transpired, and over 10, 15 million people died fighting. But focusing just on those who were exterminated purposefully, not as war victims or as collateral damage, at least not as armed war victims. Snyder frighteningly reveals that the vast bulk of them lived here. Those in Ukraine and those in Poland that were victimized by Stalin. And then the war broke out, and it got very bad. In 1939, in August, the world was shocked when Hitler and Stalin signed their non-aggression pact, which defied conventional wisdom. It defied, for all that we hear of Churchill's foresight about geopolitics, he expected that the Soviets would be a reliable ally to the United States and Britain, which eventually they were. But this shocked them. It also showed that these totalitarian states were willing to make compromises. In September of 1939, Hitler and Stalin invaded Poland, and they split it along the line that Snyder calls the Ribbentrop-Molotov line, named after the diplomats of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. or the Soviet Union, I should say. Immediately, Stalin and Hitler began acting like basically the same. And this was when Hitler really revealed his murderousness. They exterminated the Polish elite. Hitler targeted those in charge of clergy, or the clergy, those in charge of business, those in charge of politics, anyone with a lot of influence. They wanted the Poles to be reduced to the stereotype that they believed. The goal was to enslave the Slavs and subjugate them, and eventually to go into the Soviet Union and unleash more horrors. And Stalin did the same. But it wasn't until Hitler's betrayal of Stalin in Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, when Hitler betrayed his ally and went into the Soviet Union to implement what he described as the General Plan East, which was to destroy the Bolshevik state, push all the Jews eastward or to Africa, enslave the Slavs, starve to death 30 million Soviet citizens, and displace tens of millions more. That was his plan. Hitler got away with considerably less than he tried to, in a sense. He saw what Stalin did in Ukraine, and he tried to repeat it. He went into Ukraine, and he too had a plan for Ukraine, because for him, as with the socialists, his goal was to capture the food. They didn't have enough food in Germany. They saw what happened when you don't control your own food at the end of World War I. Hitler believed that you could only have autarky, this entirely self-encapsulating national economy, if you have the resources. But it wasn't fertile enough, so they needed to go into Ukraine. But they didn't have the ideological allies that the Soviets had, and they didn't have the on-the-ground police state apparatus in Ukraine to murder nearly as many as Stalin had. But it was around this time, and it was when Hitler realized that he wasn't going to be able to win the lightning victory that he promised from Operation Barbarossa. He wasn't going to be able to capture the Soviet Union so easily, that he decided to move one of his agendas up to the front. And that's when the Holocaust really began. The Holocaust is sometimes described as the persecution of Jews in the 30s. They were kicked out of civil service. They were brutalized and their businesses ransacked during Kristallnacht in November 1938. And these were obviously awful, terrible, unspeakable atrocities, but they are not the Holocaust, according to Snyder. The Holocaust was the deliberate extermination of Jews that was carried out in multiple ways. And it did not begin with gassing, it began with shooting. The Einsatzgruppen, which was Hitler's death squads serving under Himmler and involving various authorities, began shooting Jews. And east of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line is where the killing began, even further from Germany proper than the original occupation of Poland. And they began shooting. And I believe that by the end of 1942, they had shot and killed and otherwise murdered somewhere around half of those that would ultimately die. West of the line, eventually they started the gassings. It began as this carbon monoxide-based gassing, which they had used on other victims of the regime that they would transport around, but then they built these facilities. And between the Einsatzgruppen and other shootings, reprisals whereby the Nazis would murder people saying that one of them had attacked them and they were fighting back. Some of the killing that went on elsewhere, and the death camps at Belzec and Sobibor and Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka and Chelmno, they murdered over 5 million Jews. And this doesn't even include some of the Jews who died in concentration camps, which are different from death camps. The Western conception of the Holocaust is based on Anne Frank. It's based on the Belsen concentration camp, the pictures we have of, of starving, very much abused Jews, and the survivors, and mostly Western European Jews. But again, the vast bulk of those who were killed to the east in these death facilities and by shooting. So west, it was mostly gas, but some shooting. East, it was mostly shooting, but sometimes gas. This defies what a lot of us think of as totalitarianism, because totalitarianism is supposed to be the total fulfillment of state power. There's nothing really worse about state power than mass murder. And yet the mass murder conducted by these regimes were not of this internal nature primarily. They were nationalistic, they were ethnically based, they were war measures, in the case of Hitler especially. And this helps explain why it is our conception of Nazi Germany is sometimes hard to understand, because you see that within Germany, as awful as it was and as controlled by the state as it was, for a lot of Germans, it wasn't as different under the Nazi regime, especially before the war, but to some extent during, as it had been under the Weimar Republic. Milton Mayer has this book, They Thought They Were Free. He was a German-American Jew who traveled to Germany after World War II and interviewed 10 kind of normal Germans from different walks of life, and was astounded to realize most of them didn't really, at least consciously, understand the extent of what happened under Hitler, certainly the Holocaust. Some of them had an idea, but it wasn't what, there was a disconnect. The disconnect was because the Holocaust was in large part foreign policy. And of course, I know this is awful stuff. These are Ukrainians in the Holodomor starving. The Soviet system was also not equal in who it oppressed. Of course, Russians had it very bad. Many of them were conscripted in the military, many of them died. But it was also ethnically based too, nationalistic. One could even say foreign policy. Starvation was a tool as well as a product of the other communist regimes, the worst ones after Stalin. Mao took power in 1949, having butchered many people in the war with the also terrible nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, who murdered millions. And Mao represented a very odd type of statism that's hard for us to grapple with, because there's this whole revolutionary sense I was talking about, right? This idea that it's a revolution against power. And that theme continues throughout the Maoist regime. Now, in 1959 to 1961, Mao unleashed his worst atrocity, the Great Leap Forward, mass collectivization of agriculture. Most scholars seem to think that about 30 million died, which is an awful lot of people to starve to death in a period of 2 years. In between that and his other conspicuous atrocities, he had the Laogai, which was his system of 1,000 concentration camps. But it was an odd system indeed, because you see these accounts of people being tormented, right, in the concentration camps and complaining that their guards are touching them. Because in many cases, the rule was the guards couldn't touch them. There was all kinds of cultural antecedents to Maoism as it unfolded that I don't think Westerners can fully understand. I don't fully understand, that's for sure. I barely understand it. And then, of course, in the 60s to the 70s, there was the very famous Cultural Revolution. that reverted back to this idea that we need to overtake those in power. And it was an odd thing. Mao is at the top. He had he had the youth, especially in all the schools, working as agents of this revolution, and the violence went from the bottom, and it also came from the top. And this is a theme. Mao, like the other communists, would pit peasants against each other. If you have 2 or 4 times as much as he does, you're the oppressor. He inspired people to ride around their oppressors, which are people far poorer than almost anyone in the United States, probably anyone. Poor people who were the so-called oppressors, they'd ride them around like animals. It was a really crazed time, and of course the famine and all of the insanity that transpired in China rivaled what happened in parts of the Soviet Union. There are too many communists to go through all of them, but I'll just mention that Pol Pot was in many ways the worst communist. He abolished money. He executed those who wore glasses or who were literate or who had studied or who spoke the wrong languages or who practiced religion. In some accounts say that children were executed for smiling at the wrong time. It was almost inconceivable horror and control and brutality. About 1/3 of the population of Cambodia was wiped out in a period of a few years. They were all forced out of the cities. They were forced to grow rice. The idea is if we grow enough rice, we'll have a surplus and then we can buy stuff, just like previous communist theories. But he took it to a whole new level, such that when the Vietnamese communists invaded and destroyed the Khmer Rouge, it was probably one of the most genuine acts of liberation in all of history. Ironically, the United States sided with Pol Pot in that particular conflict. And then there's North Korea, which is the one truly remaining Stalinist state. North and South Korea were divided up, and North Korea was basically a satellite of the Soviet Union. Today, they're animated by this total cult of personality of their dear leader, and a racism that's really fascinating in that it's not so much based on the notion that Koreans are superior, but that, well, it is that they're superior, but not that they're smarter or stronger, but rather they're more childlike, more naive, and easily manipulated by the Japanese or by the Americans, and that they're always at siege. North Korea is probably the worst regime on earth. There are certainly times in various parts of Africa where you just see people butchering each other by the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, mass rape. So there's a sense in which that might be worse in a localized sense. But in terms of sustained control, North Korea is hell on earth. If you want to think of a world without liberty at all, that's it. I hate the American prison system. I think it's disgusting root and branch, but with the exception of some of the worst solitary confinement, I think it'd be safe to say you're better off in a prison here than free there. But there's a lot that what I've been discussing kind of brings to the foreground with this concept of totalitarianism. You know, communism versus fascism. The communists claim that fascism is totalitarian. They argue that what Hitler did is worse than what practically any communist did, and that's true, and therefore that's the real fulfillment of the total negation of humanity. How dare you compare the dream of a worker's paradise, even if we have some hiccups along the way? How dare you compare that? The right wing will reverse it and say communism's the true totalitarianism because it's not totalitarianism unless you have total control of the economy, and fascism doesn't allow for that. Fascism and National Socialism. Some say Hitler was the epitome of fascism, others say he wasn't quite one. We have these questions of internationalism versus nationalism that keep cropping up. the concept of permanent revolution that Trotsky advocated versus Stalinist nationalism. Terror and genocide, which we all associate with totalitarianism. But, you know, as terrible as Yugoslavia under Tito was, a basket case economically, not a human rights beacon by any sense, it was not nearly the genocidal regime that some of these others were. I believe you were free to leave, right? That is you know, the right to exit is pretty big in the scheme of total statism, because most of these regimes I'm talking about, there's nothing remotely like that. And many of the communist regimes, especially the Albania and Yugoslavia that were independent from the Soviet Union, and some of the communistic regimes in Latin America and elsewhere, they're brutal, they're murderous, no one should walk around with t-shirts with these people's faces on them, but they're not quite Stalinistic or Maoist or like Pol Pot. Ho Chi Minh, which I didn't mention, and Vietnam, horrible, murderer, you know, racist, but not as bad in his own way as the North Korean regime or Mao. And so it becomes difficult when you say communism's more totalitarianism than fascism, because some communist regimes are very free compared to some fascist regimes, and vice versa. As bad as Mussolini was, he wasn't as bad as Stalin. And then there's this ideal that the totalitarianism is really supposed to represent the total state. But there is no total state, thankfully. When we think about the total state, we think of a state that controls all, that knows all, that controls each individually roughly equally. But that's not how these regimes work. They didn't kill everyone equally. They didn't oppress everyone equally. And like more traditional states, they often got worse during crises and during wars, and they followed a certain logic universal to states in general. As Murray Rothbard pointed out, when communists take over a state, despite their ideology, they're now in charge of the state, and there are dynamics of state power that take over. There are economic laws that take over. Yeah, you can abolish money altogether for a few years, but you can't sustain that forever. And so even the Soviet Union wasn't a total state. And we see with Khrushchev and Brezhnev, it becomes, with some bumps, less and less Stalinistic. Hell, they even criticize Stalin. And in some of these regimes, the leader isn't as totally in control as you might think. There are sometimes even Hitler's orders were ignored late in the war. There were times when Stalin was vying to maintain his political authority, paranoid that he would lose it. There were times that Mussolini had to cut deals with other power centers to maintain his power. They all dreamt of a totality of power in the center that's impossible. Thank goodness. So we've had all these theories of totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, after World War II, looked at Stalinism and Nazism under a similar rubric. She saw anti-Semitism in both. She saw this desire to control society from the top down in both. We see the Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, focusing on the inevitability, the historicity, this idea that the state is your path to something else. And we see Carl Frederick's definition, which I summed up earlier, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, the political theorist and Carter's national security advisor, who see the communism and fascism as equally totalitarian, but it depends on which communism and which fascism. We see Robert Conquest, a great historian and scholar. I'm not trying to say any of these people aren't great thinkers. They're all better than me, but Conquest sees the roots in the Enlightenment, which, you know, there's some truth to that, but how far can you take it? None of them have the total monopoly. Thank goodness. In 1984, George Orwell sketches out this conception of totalitarianism that goes beyond what Hitler or Stalin did. O'Brien, who represents Big Brother, is brutalizing Winston Smith, our protagonist, and he says, you know, Hitler and Stalin each went pretty far, but they didn't take it far enough. He says the goal is totalitarianism for its own sake. The object of terrorism is terrorism. The object of oppression is oppression. The object of torture is torture. The object of murder is murder. And the object of power is power. Now do you begin to understand me, he says. That's pretty stark. But with the exception of, you could say North Korea hinges on this, but in truth, most so-called totalitarian regimes can't quite get there. Now, very briefly, I only have a couple minutes. I want to go back to this first idea of comparing the United States regime, whether under Republican or Democrat, to totalitarianism. We don't have a single-party state. We have two states, but they govern similarly, and those are the only two you get. Moreover, I've noticed that most Democrats are proud we have a democracy, but they always want their state to win, their party to win. The Republicans are also proud, but they also want their party to always win. So it's almost as if both sides are proud of democracy, but both believe that the democracy should always be run by their one party. We have economic, in a sense, Yvonne mentioned it, fascism. It's muted, it's not total, it never is total, but it's not as bad as some fascist regimes, no doubt. But the New Deal was in part modeled after Mussolini. The corporativism, as Mussolini described it, this fusion of business and state. FDR had people who admired Stalin, but he also had people in his brain trust who really liked Mussolini. And the National Recovery Administration, which was made to centralized economic power. They suspended the antitrust laws, which I don't favor, but they did it for the purpose of consolidating businesses under code authorities, modeled right out of Mussolini. And the entire corporate state in America, more than we'd like to think, has this fascist element. Do we have the nationalism that they had in the worst fascist states and the worst communist states? Not quite. Well, here's a picture of a bunch of school children giving the Heil salute, right? Now check this out. That was, of course, the way it was done before World War II, as was mentioned earlier. But I do think that Americans take a certain pride in the nation state of the United States. It's armed forces, certainly, that has a totalitarian element when it's at its worst, anyway. You just look at what people say on, YouTube or Facebook. Well, we should just butcher every Muslim because of what happened, because of a couple Muslims. And that's an oversimplification, but there's a very frightening nationalism, and sometimes it's mixed with ethnic identity. And I will bring up the point about ethnic and racial crimes. They do exist in the United States. They're more implicit, like with the war on drugs, though that is disproportionately targeted against blacks. I recommend Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow to understand how. We have the immigration enforcement, and we have a history of racial crimes and strife and atrocities that, unlike in some countries, modern Americans have never come to terms with. Yeah, we all acknowledge that slavery was bad, and killing American Indians was bad, and Japanese internment was bad, yet we still revere the people who did this. We have this continuity in our regime. We still respect George Washington and Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, who executed American Indians. We still respect Franklin Roosevelt. We put these people on our money. And speaking of these people, the leader principle. We don't just have one charismatic ruler. We have one every 4 or 8 years. And they don't have the totalitarian control that some totalitarian rulers did. But they do have a lot of power. They have the power to destroy any country they want with nuclear weapons. They have the power to target and kill anyone they want. And there's a sense in which our leader principle has this twist to it. Because in America, it's not monarchical or hereditary or ethnic. It's if you're institutionally in line, going back to the, if you are the heir of George Washington institutionally, you have certain powers and certain authorities. In fact, more power in a sense than anyone has ever had on this planet. And you look at the inaugurations, and you look at our presidents and how they amass 1 million people in front of them when they become reelected, or you look at the way they're followed by a parade of food tasters and doctors and a virtual army that follows them wherever they go. And we have most of the killing done by the US government. I'm not saying it's the same, but what is similar is that most of the killing is not directed within the United States. It's directed outward. When millions were murdered in Korea or Vietnam, it was directed outward, so Americans didn't think about it. They didn't think of their country as anything other than a free country. Do we have the police state that these other regimes did? Well, not exactly, but we have 2.5 million people behind bars, the biggest prison population on earth, except perhaps the Chinese labor camps, because we don't know how many are in there. We have a police force that just gets more and more militarized and ominous every day. We have the largest imperial presence in world history. And we have the largest surveillance state, which we now learn has basically total access to everything, or at least it's going to get that access soon. In fact, the US surveillance state, which sweeps up all of our emails and looks at where we go online and looks at our phone records, and in many cases records our phone calls. It tracks where we send our mail. It takes photos of all our packages. It tracks where all our cars are. This is stuff that the Stasi would have dreamt of having. It goes way beyond what Hitler or Stalin ever dreamed of. Now, would have they taken it? Would have they done worse things with it? Sure, but the infrastructure is there. So, totalitarianism is a continuum. It's an idea that has never reached the total fulfillment that we sometimes think of it as having. And I think only if you really appreciate that and appreciate the gradations and appreciate that, yes, Obama is not at all like Mao. Bush was not at all like Hitler. These people were aberrations, even among total state dictators. If you acknowledge all that, then you can kind of unravel it and look at the substantive similarities between what we have even in the United States and much of the rest of the West, much of the rest of the world, and what it is we don't like about totalitarianism. Because what we don't like about totalitarianism is what it does to people. And in too many particulars, we see it creeping even here in the so-called land of the free, the country that stared down Hitler and then later its former ally, the Soviet Union. And so I want to be cautious and nuanced because people are prone to hyperbole and I don't want to go there. But I do fear that one day, if things don't turn around, we will see a book called The Americans, They Thought They Were Free. Thank you.